The moment you notice someone trying too hard not to be seen is often the moment you should start paying attention. Ethan Caldwell heard the ice clink softly against crystal as he stepped into the Grand Crescent Hotel ballroom. Chicago shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Investors, executives, politicians, industry leaders. The annual charity gala had become one of the most influential business events in the city. Everywhere he looked, expensive suits moved beneath golden chandeliers. Laughter mixed with the sound of live piano music. Waiters navigated the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with drinks. For Ethan, it was another obligation on an already crowded calendar. Another evening of handshakes, conversations, and strategic networking. Yet before the night was over, one small moment would stay with him far longer than any deal discussed in the ballroom. Near the center of the room, Hannah Brooks moved quietly between tables. Most people barely noticed her. She was a waitress assigned to the VIP section. Her dark apron hung neatly over her uniform. Her movements were efficient and practiced. She carried herself with calm professionalism despite the demanding pace around her. A few guests dismissed her with quick nods. Others ignored her completely. Hannah seemed accustomed to it. She simply continued working. Ethan noticed her only because she appeared different from the other servers. While everyone else focused on delivering drinks and clearing plates, Hannah seemed to be watching the room itself. Her eyes moved carefully from table to table. Not nervously, not suspiciously, attentively, as though she were quietly assembling pieces of a puzzle nobody else realized existed. Ethan dismissed the thought and turned his attention back to a conversation with several investors. Minutes later, he found himself seated at a reserved table near the front of the ballroom. A crystal glass of sparkling water sat beside his place setting. Around him, guests discussed acquisitions, market forecasts, and political developments. Everything felt predictable. Then Hannah appeared beside the table carrying a tray. Ethan glanced up just in time to see something strange. For a fraction of a second, Hannah looked toward the crowd. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for someone observant to notice. Then, without speaking a word, she reached toward the table. Her hand moved calmly. Deliberately, she lifted Ethan's glass and exchanged it with another identical glass from her tray. The motion took less than 2 seconds. Smooth, silent, almost invisible. Most people at the table never noticed. Ethan did. He watched her place the replacement glass precisely where the original had been. Hannah immediately continued serving as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan frowned. Why would a waitress switch a guest's drink after it had already been served? He looked down at the glass. Nothing appeared different. No explanation came. Hannah did not apologize. She did not speak. She simply walked away into the crowd. Yet before disappearing among the guests, she glanced back once. Their eyes met briefly across the ballroom. There was no panic in her expression, no confusion, only certainty. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, that certainty unsettled him far more than the silent switch itself. Ethan Caldwell continued staring at the glass long after Hannah Brooks disappeared into the crowd. Around him, the gala carried on without interruption. Laughter drifted across the ballroom. A violin joined the piano on stage. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays filled with sparkling water and elegant desserts. Yet Ethan found himself distracted by a simple question. Why had she switched his drink? He lifted the glass slightly and examined it beneath the chandelier light. It looked identical to the one she had removed. Same crystal, same ice cubes, same clear liquid. Nothing appeared unusual. Across the table, a venture capitalist noticed his expression. Everything all right? Ethan set the glass down. A waitress just replaced my drink without saying a word. The man laughed. Maybe she thought it looked lonely. A few guests smiled politely before returning to their conversations. Ethan tried to do the same. Normally, he would have forgotten the incident immediately. Instead, something about Hannah's behavior continued bothering him. Not because she switched the glass, because she had seemed absolutely certain she needed to. Several minutes later, Ethan spotted her again near the far side of the ballroom. She was serving another table. Unlike many of the staff members rushing to keep up with the crowd, Hannah moved with deliberate calm. Her attention never remained in one place for long. She seemed to notice everything. A spilled drink before it reached the floor. An elderly guest needing assistance with a chair. A server struggling with an overloaded tray. Small details invisible to most people somehow drew her attention immediately. Ethan watched as she briefly paused beside a decorative column. Her gaze shifted toward the entrance, then toward the bar, then toward the VIP tables. The behavior looked less like serving guests and more like monitoring the room. A strange thought crossed his mind. Hannah looked like someone expecting something to happen. The idea sounded ridiculous. This was a charity gala, not a crime novel. Yet the feeling remained. Meanwhile, Hannah continued working as though nothing unusual had occurred. She delivered drinks, collected empty glasses, smiled politely at guests. Only her eyes betrayed a quiet alertness. Near the ballroom entrance, a man in a dark gray suit stepped inside. Ethan barely noticed him. Hundreds of guests had arrived throughout the evening. There was nothing remarkable about another attendee entering the room. Hannah noticed him immediately. Ethan saw the change from across the ballroom. Her shoulders tightened slightly. Her attention followed the man as he moved through the crowd. Not fear. Not recognition exactly. Concern. The man accepted a drink from another server and disappeared among the guests. Hannah resumed working, yet she glanced toward him twice more over the next few minutes. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Now he was certain of one thing. The glass switch and Hannah's unusual focus were connected somehow. He simply could not understand how. Then Hannah passed his table once more. Their eyes met briefly. Ethan expected her to explain herself. She did not. She offered the same professional smile she gave every guest and continued walking. But just before she moved away, her gaze dropped toward the untouched glass in front of him. For a moment, relief appeared on her face. Then it vanished as quickly as it came. And that tiny expression unsettled Ethan far more than the silent switch itself. The longer the evening continued, the more Ethan Caldwell found himself paying attention to Hannah Brooks instead of the people seated around him. It made no sense. Billion-dollar negotiations had demanded less of his attention than a waitress carrying a serving tray. Yet every instinct told him something important was unfolding beneath the surface of the gala. Across the ballroom, the man in the gray suit continued moving between groups of guests. Nothing about him appeared suspicious at first glance. He smiled when spoken to. He accepted handshakes. He blended naturally into the crowd. Still, Hannah's eyes kept returning to him. Not constantly. Carefully, as though she did not want anyone noticing she was watching. Ethan followed the man's movements for several minutes. Eventually, he convinced himself he was being ridiculous. Hannah was probably concerned about a guest who needed assistance. Perhaps the man had asked for special accommodations. Perhaps she simply recognized him from a previous event. Rational explanations existed. Yet none of them explained the silent relief that had crossed her face when she realized Ethan had not touched the original glass. A charity director stepped onto the stage to begin the evening's keynote introductions. Conversations gradually quieted. Guests turned toward the podium. Soft applause filled the room. Ethan glanced down at the replacement glass beside him. The ice had begun to melt slightly. Tiny droplets of condensation reflected the ballroom lights. For reasons he could not explain, he still had not taken a sip. On the opposite side of the room, Hannah paused near a service station. Another waitress spoke to her briefly. Hannah nodded politely, but her attention drifted past the conversation. Her gaze landed once more on the man in the gray suit. This time, Ethan noticed something new. The man appeared interested in the VIP section, not in any specific conversation, not on the stage, in the tables themselves. His eyes lingered there repeatedly before moving away whenever someone looked in his direction. A faint tension settled over Ethan. The sensation was difficult to describe. Nothing alarming had happened. No obvious threat existed. Yet the atmosphere suddenly felt different. More fragile somehow. The keynote speech continued. Applause rose and faded. Servers circulated quietly through the room. Then Ethan noticed the man in gray approach the bar. He exchanged a few words with a bartender before accepting a fresh drink. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. Yet Hannah reacted immediately. She set down the tray she was carrying and changed direction. Her pace remained professional. Unhurried. But she moved toward the VIP area with unmistakable purpose. Ethan watched her navigate through the crowd. Guests stepped aside without realizing they were doing so. Within moments, she reached a nearby service station. Her eyes moved quickly across several glasses. Then toward Ethan's table. Then back toward the crowd. The realization struck him unexpectedly. Hannah had known something before she switched his drink. Whatever she had noticed had not happened by accident. She had made a decision, a deliberate one. And now, as the gala continued beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, she looked less like a waitress serving guests and more like the only person in the room preparing for a problem nobody else could see. The keynote speaker had barely reached the middle of his presentation when a subtle disturbance rippled through the ballroom. It was so small that most guests never noticed. A server carrying a tray paused unexpectedly near the bar. A bartender exchanged a brief glance with another employee. Conversations continued. Laughter returned between sections of the speech. Yet Hannah Brooks saw the reaction immediately. Ethan Caldwell saw Hannah see it. That alone was enough to keep his attention fixed on her. From his table, he watched her move toward the service area with quiet determination. She was no longer simply reacting to events. She appeared to be confirming something. The strange certainty he had noticed earlier remained visible in every movement she made. Hannah stopped beside a senior catering supervisor and spoke softly. The supervisor frowned. Hannah pointed discreetly toward the VIP section, then toward the bar, then toward a cluster of glasses waiting to be delivered. The supervisor looked unconvinced. Hannah said something else. This time the supervisor's expression changed. Not alarm, concern. Within moments, two staff members quietly removed a tray from service and carried it into a restricted area behind the ballroom. The action happened so smoothly that guests remained completely unaware. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Whatever was happening, it was no longer occurring only inside Hannah's imagination. A few minutes later, the man in the gray suit approached another group of executives near the center of the room. He smiled comfortably and joined their conversation. Nothing about his behavior seemed unusual. Yet Hannah continued watching him. Not constantly, just enough to make it clear she had not dismissed whatever had caught her attention earlier. The keynote presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause. Guests began standing and moving around the ballroom once again. Music resumed. Fresh drinks appeared. The evening seemed to return to normal. Then a hotel security manager entered the room through a side door. He was dressed professionally enough to avoid attracting attention, but Ethan recognized him immediately. Security managers rarely appeared inside high-profile events unless a situation required review. The manager exchanged a few quiet words with the catering supervisor. Both glanced briefly toward Hannah. Ethan felt a chill of curiosity. Nobody looked panicked. Nobody appeared frightened. Yet several people suddenly seemed interested in a waitress whose existence most guests had ignored all evening. Hannah remained focused on her work. She collected empty glasses, refilled water, cleared plates. To anyone not paying attention, she looked exactly the same as before. But Ethan was paying attention. He noticed the way security personnel subtly repositioned themselves throughout the ballroom. He noticed the way the catering supervisor remained unusually close to the service area. Most importantly, he noticed that Hannah finally seemed slightly less tense, as though a problem had been contained. Not solved, contained. Then something unexpected happened. The security manager approached Ethan's table directly. He offered a polite smile and asked a simple question. "Mr. Caldwell, have you consumed any drinks from this table this evening?" Ethan glanced at the untouched glass beside him. For a moment, the entire evening seemed to narrow around that single question. He looked back toward Hannah. Across the crowded ballroom, she met his gaze once more. And for the first time that night, Ethan realized he was no longer wondering why she had switched the glass. He was beginning to wonder what might have happened if she had not. The security manager's question seemed simple, yet it instantly transformed the atmosphere around Ethan Caldwell's table. The conversations nearby continued. Glasses clinked. Music drifted through the ballroom. To everyone else, the gala remained elegant and ordinary. To Ethan, it suddenly felt very different. He looked at the untouched glass beside him and answered honestly, "No, I have not." The security manager nodded once. A subtle sign of relief crossed his face before disappearing behind professional composure. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan studied him carefully. "Would you mind telling me what is going on?" The manager hesitated. Not because he wanted to hide information, because he was choosing his words carefully. "At the moment, we are verifying a concern raised by one of our staff members." Ethan already knew which staff member. His eyes moved across the ballroom toward Hannah Brooks. She was collecting empty plates from a nearby table. To anyone watching, she appeared completely focused on her job. The security manager followed Ethan's gaze. She noticed something unusual earlier this evening. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Unusual enough to replace my drink. The manager remained silent for a moment. Then he said, yes. Before Ethan could ask another question, a member of the hotel's executive team approached the security manager and whispered something in his ear. The manager's expression sharpened immediately. He thanked Ethan and excused himself. Ethan watched him cross the ballroom toward a restricted service corridor. 2 additional security personnel followed seconds later. Whatever concern Hannah had raised was no longer theoretical. Meanwhile, Hannah continued working. Ethan found that remarkable. Most people would have been watching the investigation unfold. Most people would have been anxious to know whether they were right. Hannah seemed content simply doing her job. Yet now that he knew what to look for, Ethan noticed details he had missed earlier. She remained aware of everything around her. Every entrance, every exit, every movement near the service stations. Her attention never appeared frantic. It was calm observation, the kind developed through experience. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the security manager returned. This time he approached Hannah directly. They spoke quietly near a column overlooking the ballroom. Ethan could not hear a single word. He did not need to. The manager's body language revealed enough. Respect, gratitude, relief. Hannah listened carefully. Then she nodded once. Nothing more. No dramatic reaction. No celebration. The manager walked away while Hannah returned to work exactly as before. Ethan stared at the scene in disbelief. The person who appeared least interested in receiving attention had somehow become the most important individual in the room. A few minutes later, guests remained unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The gala proceeded smoothly. The keynote speaker mingled with donors. Investors exchanged business cards. Photographers captured smiling faces. The evening had been preserved from disruption. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about one possibility. If Hannah had not acted when she did, would the evening still look the same? His gaze drifted toward the untouched replacement glass. Condensation still glimmered beneath the chandelier light. A simple object. Ordinary. Forgettable. Yet somehow it had become the center of a mystery that nobody seemed willing to discuss openly. Then Hannah passed his table once again. This time Ethan spoke before she could continue walking. Miss Brooks. She stopped politely. Yes, sir. Ethan looked directly at her. I think you owe me an explanation. For the first time all evening, Hannah's calm expression revealed the slightest trace of hesitation. Hannah Brooks stood beside Ethan Caldwell's table for a moment longer than professional etiquette normally allowed. Around them, the gala continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Music floated through the ballroom. Conversations rose and fell. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of chandeliers. Yet for Hannah and Ethan, the noise seemed distant. Ethan waited patiently. Hannah glanced briefly toward the service area before looking back at him. I am not sure I am allowed to discuss it, sir, she said quietly. Ethan folded his hands. The security manager asked whether I drank from that glass. You switched it without permission. I think that gives me a reason to ask questions. Hannah considered his words carefully. Then she nodded. That is fair. She looked toward the untouched replacement glass. Earlier this evening, I noticed something that did not feel right. Ethan listened without interrupting. What exactly did you notice? Hannah took a slow breath. Not one thing. Several small things. Ethan frowned slightly. Such as, Hannah glanced around to ensure no guests were listening. A man spent a long time near the service area without speaking to anyone. Then he moved away whenever staff approached. Later, I saw him near a tray that had already been prepared for the VIP section. A few minutes after that, I noticed one of the glasses had been moved. Ethan looked at the glass again. And that was enough for you to replace it? Hannah nodded. I could not prove anything. I could not accuse anyone. But I knew I would rather replace one drink than ignore what I saw. Ethan studied her face. There was no drama in her explanation. No attempt to sound heroic. She was simply describing a decision. You took a risk, he said. Hannah smiled faintly. Not really. The worst thing that could happen was an angry guest wondering why his drink changed. Ethan almost laughed. The understatement was remarkable. Before he could respond, the security manager approached the table once more. This time his expression carried visible relief. He looked at Hannah first. Miss Brooks, thank you again. Then he turned to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, I believe I can share a limited update. Ethan nodded immediately. The manager lowered his voice. Our team reviewed surveillance footage and inspected several service items after Miss Brooks reported her concern. We found enough irregularities to justify removing certain beverages from circulation and conducting additional review. Ethan noticed the careful wording. The manager was choosing every sentence with precision. So she was right, he asked. The manager looked toward Hannah. Her observations were extremely valuable. For the first time all evening, Ethan saw genuine respect in another person's eyes when they looked at the waitress. Not sympathy, not politeness. Respect. The manager excused himself moments later. Hannah shifted her tray slightly. If that is all, I should probably get back to work. Ethan looked at her with growing disbelief. Most people would have spent the evening talking about what they had done. Hannah seemed eager to return to carrying plates and refilling water glasses. You are really going back to work? He asked. Hannah smiled softly. Someone has to keep the guests happy. Then she turned and walked away into the crowd. Ethan watched her disappear among hundreds of people. For the first time that evening, he realized the mystery was no longer what had happened to the glass. The real mystery was Hannah Brooks herself. The gala finally began winding down as midnight approached. Guests drifted toward the exits carrying gift bags and exchanging final handshakes. The musicians packed away their instruments. Hotel staff cleared tables beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers. Yet Ethan Caldwell remained seated longer than most. His attention continued returning to Hannah Brooks. The unanswered questions had only multiplied. By every reasonable measure, the evening should have ended with discussions about investments and charitable donations. Instead, he found himself thinking about a waitress who had quietly altered the course of the night. Near the service station, Hannah helped stack trays and organize supplies for cleanup. Her co-workers appeared relaxed now. Whatever concern had occupied security earlier seemed to have been resolved. Ethan noticed several employees speaking to Hannah with unusual warmth. One server squeezed her shoulder in appreciation. Another smiled and shook her head as though still amazed by something. Hannah accepted the attention politely, but never encouraged it. She simply continued working. Eventually, Ethan stood and crossed the ballroom. Several members of his executive team attempted to stop him with last-minute questions. He answered briefly before continuing toward the service area. Hannah looked up as he approached. Surprise crossed her face. Mr. Caldwell. Ethan smiled slightly. I was hoping to speak with you before I left. Hannah set down a stack of menus. Of course. For a moment, neither spoke. The ballroom suddenly felt much quieter than it had all evening. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty room. The security manager was careful with his words. Hannah nodded. That sounds like him. Which means I still do not know exactly what happened. Hannah hesitated. Then she looked toward the entrance where the man in the gray suit had appeared hours earlier. I noticed behavior that did not match the situation, she said. People reveal a lot through patterns. Ethan listened carefully. You figured that out from watching guests. Hannah smiled faintly. Not just guests. Everyone. Ethan folded his arms. Most people would not notice those things. Hannah laughed softly. Most people are busy. The answer lingered in the air. It sounded simple. Yet Ethan suspected it explained far more than she realized. Where did you learn to observe like that? He asked. Hannah looked away briefly. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion appeared behind her calm professionalism. Not discomfort. Memory. Life teaches some lessons whether you ask for them or not, she said quietly. Before Ethan could ask another question, the hotel's general manager entered the ballroom. His expression brightened immediately when he spotted Hannah. There you are. He walked directly toward her. Security just finished their review. Hannah straightened slightly. Ethan watched closely. The manager smiled. They confirmed your observations were correct. If you had not spoken up when you did, tonight could have become a very different evening. Hannah lowered her eyes for a moment. I'm glad everything worked out. The manager shook his head. It worked out because you paid attention. Then he thanked her again before moving away. Silence followed. Ethan looked at Hannah differently now. The mystery was gone. The truth was becoming clear. She had not acted out of luck. She had not stumbled into the situation accidentally. She had recognized warning signs long before anyone else. And somehow, standing beneath the fading ballroom lights in a simple waitress uniform, Hannah Brooks seemed far more remarkable than many of the powerful people who had filled the room that evening. The gala ended shortly after midnight, but Ethan Caldwell could not leave the evening behind as easily as he left the ballroom. The drive back to his penthouse took less than 30 minutes. The questions followed him the entire way. By the next morning, they were still there. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office overlooking downtown Chicago. Reports covered his desk. Meetings filled his schedule. Yet every time he tried focusing on business, his thoughts returned to Hannah Brooks. A waitress had quietly identified a problem before security, management, and hundreds of highly successful guests noticed anything. More surprisingly, she had done it without seeking recognition. Ethan had spent years around people eager to claim credit for every achievement. Hannah seemed determined to avoid it. That difference stayed with him. Shortly after lunch, he called a trusted member of his executive team. "I need a favor." The executive smiled. "That usually means work for me." Ethan nodded. "I want to know more about someone." The executive raised an eyebrow. "Business competitor?" "No." Ethan paused. "A waitress." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. "A waitress?" Ethan almost laughed at the reaction. It sounded strange even to him. "Her name is Hannah Brooks. She works at the Grand Crescent Hotel." By late afternoon, a file arrived. Ethan opened it expecting very little. Perhaps a brief employment history. Maybe a few references. What he found surprised him immediately. Hannah had worked at the hotel for nearly 8 years. Employee evaluations described her using remarkably similar language. Observant, reliable, calm under pressure, exceptional judgment, trusted by management. Several supervisors specifically mentioned her ability to identify problems before they escalated. Ethan leaned back in his chair. One evaluation contained a handwritten note from a former manager. "If every employee noticed details the way Hannah does, my job would be easy." Ethan continued reading. Then he reached a section that surprised him even more. Years earlier, Hannah had completed coursework in behavioral psychology and organizational communication. She had never finished her degree. Family circumstances had forced her to leave school and begin working full-time. Ethan stared at the page. Suddenly many things made more sense. Her observations, her attention to patterns, the way she read people. Yet even that explanation felt incomplete. Education could teach techniques. It could not fully explain the calm confidence she displayed during the gala. Later that week, Ethan found himself attending another event at the Grand Crescent Hotel. The meeting had nothing to do with Hannah. At least that was what he told himself. As he crossed the lobby afterward, he noticed her behind a reception area helping a guest resolve a reservation issue. The guest appeared frustrated. Hannah remained perfectly composed. She listened carefully, asked a few questions, then offered a solution. Within minutes, the guest was smiling. The problem disappeared. Ethan watched from a distance. Once again, she noticed something others missed. This time it was not a suspicious pattern. It was a person's frustration before it became a larger issue. Hannah eventually looked up and spotted him standing across the lobby. Surprise crossed her face. Then she smiled politely. The same simple smile she offered everyone. Yet now Ethan understood something he had missed before. Hannah Brooks was not extraordinary because of what happened at the gala. What happened at the gala was merely the first time anyone important had bothered to notice how extraordinary she already was. Over the next several days, Ethan Caldwell found reasons to visit the Grand Crescent Hotel more often than his schedule required. He told himself the meetings were convenient. The location was central. Clients liked the atmosphere. The explanations sounded reasonable until he realized he was timing some of those visits around Hannah Brooks's shifts. The realization amused him. He had built companies, negotiated international contracts, and managed thousands of employees. Yet somehow a waitress had become the most interesting person he had encountered all month. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan arrived at the hotel for a meeting that ended earlier than expected. As he crossed the lobby, he spotted Hannah seated alone in a quiet corner of the cafe during her break. A book rested open on the table beside a cup of coffee. Most people spent breaks scrolling through their phones. Hannah was studying. Ethan hesitated only briefly before approaching. "Mind if I join you?" Hannah looked up, surprised. Then she smiled politely. "Not at all." Ethan sat across from her and glanced at the book. It was not casual reading. Notes filled the margins. Several pages contained colored tabs. "Still studying?" he asked. Hannah laughed softly. "I suppose some habits never disappear." Ethan leaned back. "You never finished school." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Hannah's expression revealed immediate understanding. "You looked into my background." Ethan nodded. "I did." To his relief, she did not seem offended. Instead, She closed the book and rested her hands around the coffee cup. Then you already know the short version. Ethan shook his head. I know records. I do not know the story. For a moment, Hannah looked through the cafe windows toward the busy Chicago street outside. My mother became sick during my final year, she said. Quietly. Someone had to help. School could wait. Life had other plans. Ethan listened carefully. There was no bitterness in her voice. No resentment. Only acceptance. And after that, he asked. Hannah smiled faintly. After that, there were bills. Then responsibilities. Then more bills. Ethan found himself smiling as well. The honesty felt refreshing. You make it sound simple. Hannah shrugged. Most difficult things become simple when they happen one day at a time. The answer stayed with him. It sounded like something learned through experience rather than philosophy. Their conversation continued longer than either expected. They spoke about books, communication, observation, and human behavior. Again and again, Hannah revealed insights that surprised him. Not because she spoke dramatically, because she understood people unusually well. Eventually, Ethan asked the question that had been lingering in his mind since the gala. When you saw that problem developing, what convinced you to act? Hannah considered the question carefully. Because nobody else seemed to notice. Ethan frowned. That was enough? She nodded. If everyone ignores something unusual, the risk usually becomes larger, not smaller. Ethan stared at her for several seconds. Then he laughed quietly. You know, most executives spend years learning risk management. Hannah smiled. People are not that different from systems. Patterns matter. As her break ended, she stood and picked up the book. Ethan noticed the worn cover and dozens of handwritten notes tucked inside. Evidence of years spent learning whenever time allowed. As Hannah prepared to leave, Ethan realized something important. The story he had been telling himself was wrong. Hannah Brooks was not a waitress who happened to be intelligent. She was an exceptionally intelligent woman who happened to work as a waitress. And that distinction changed everything. The conversation in the hotel cafe stayed with Ethan Caldwell long after he returned to his office. During the following week, he found himself noticing things he had previously overlooked. Employees who quietly solved problems before they appeared. Assistants who anticipated. Challenges without recognition. Managers who carried entire departments without demanding praise. Hannah Brooks had changed more than his opinion of one waitress. She had changed the way he looked at people. On Friday morning, Ethan attended a leadership meeting at company headquarters. Around a polished conference table, executives discussed efficiency reports, hiring strategies, and organizational growth. The numbers were impressive. The projections looked strong. Yet Ethan's thoughts kept returning to a simple observation Hannah had made. People are not that different from systems. Patterns matter. As the meeting continued, he noticed something unusual in his own organization. Several senior managers spoke frequently. Others barely spoke at all. The loudest voices dominated the room. The quietest voices often carried the most useful information. For years he had known this intellectually. Hannah had somehow forced him to see it emotionally. Later that afternoon, he received a call from the general manager of the Grand Crescent Hotel. The manager wanted to thank him for attending recent events and casually mentioned that Hannah had once again helped resolve a complicated situation involving guest services. Nothing dramatic. Nothing newsworthy. Just another example of exceptional judgment. Ethan smiled after ending the call. The pattern continued. Wherever Hannah worked, problems seemed to become solutions. A few days later, he arranged another meeting at the hotel. This time he arrived early. Through the lobby windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Chicago's skyline disappeared behind gray clouds. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm and calm. Ethan spotted Hannah near the reception desk, helping a family visiting from out of state. The parents looked overwhelmed. Their young son appeared tired from travel. Within minutes, Hannah had located information about local attractions, arranged assistance with luggage, and turned a stressful arrival into a pleasant experience. The family thanked her repeatedly. Hannah simply smiled and returned to work. Ethan waited until she finished before approaching. You seem to do that everywhere. Hannah looked puzzled. Do? What? Make difficult situations look easy. Hannah laughed. That is because you only see the ending. You do not see the work before it. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that is true. They walked slowly through the lobby as guests moved around them. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows. For a moment, the busy hotel felt surprisingly quiet. Then Ethan stopped. Have you ever considered returning to school? Hannah looked genuinely surprised by the question. Sometimes. Why not? She smiled gently. Life still exists. Bills still arrive. Ethan noticed there was no self-pity in her answer. Only reality. That honesty made her words even more powerful. After a brief silence, he asked another question. What would you study if nothing stood in your way? Hannah looked toward the rain-covered city beyond the glass. Her answer came without hesitation. Human behavior, communication, decision-making, the reasons people do what they do. Ethan smiled slowly. The answer sounded exactly like her. As he watched the reflections of city lights beginning to appear on the wet streets outside, a new idea formed quietly in his mind. It was not an act of charity. It was not gratitude for one evening at a gala. It was something far more important. For the first time since meeting Hannah Brooks, Ethan began wondering what might happen if someone finally gave her the opportunity she truly deserved. The idea followed Ethan Caldwell for days. He resisted acting on it at first, not because he doubted Hannah Brooks. Quite the opposite. The more he learned about her, the more carefully he wanted to proceed. He had seen too many wealthy people confuse opportunity with charity. He had no interest in offering Hannah a favor. She deserved something far more meaningful than that. 1 week later, Ethan arrived at the Grand Crescent Hotel carrying a slim folder beneath his arm. Outside, autumn had begun transforming Chicago. Golden leaves drifted along the sidewalks. A cool breeze moved between the buildings. Inside the hotel, the familiar rhythm of guests, conversations, and rolling suitcases filled the lobby. Hannah was finishing a conversation with an elderly couple when she noticed him approaching. Her expression brightened with polite surprise. Mr. Caldwell. Ethan smiled. Do you have a few minutes? Hannah glanced toward the reception supervisor, who nodded approvingly. A short break was arranged, and they settled into a quiet corner of the cafe where they had spoken before. For a few moments, neither mentioned the folder resting on the table. They spoke about ordinary things. The weather, books, a recent community event hosted at the hotel. Eventually, Ethan placed a hand on the folder. I have been thinking about our last conversation. Hannah tilted her head slightly. That sounds dangerous. Ethan laughed. Possibly. Then he slid the folder toward her. Hannah opened it carefully. Several documents rested inside. Program descriptions, university information, professional development opportunities, research fellowships, leadership courses. Her eyes moved slowly across the pages. Confusion appeared first. Then curiosity. What is this? Ethan leaned forward. Possibilities. Hannah looked up. For who? For you. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind created when someone encounters an idea they never expected to hear. Hannah studied the documents again. These programs are expensive. Ethan nodded. Some are. And competitive. Very. Hannah closed the folder gently. Then I do not understand. Ethan chose his words carefully. You spent years helping other people solve problems. You notice patterns most people miss. You understand human behavior better than many consultants I have hired. The only thing standing between you and larger opportunities seems to be access. Hannah looked away briefly. The city moved beyond the cafe windows. Cars passed. Pedestrians hurried along crowded sidewalks. Life continued normally while her world shifted slightly beneath her feet. I appreciate the compliment, she said quietly. It is not a compliment. Ethan's voice remained calm. It is an observation. Hannah smiled faintly at that. The distinction mattered. She understood that. And what exactly are you proposing? Ethan pointed toward the folder. I would like to sponsor your return to school or professional development. Not as a gift. Not as charity. As an investment. Hannah stared at him. For the first time since they met, she seemed genuinely speechless. Ethan continued before she could object. You earned my respect the night of the gala. Everything I learned afterward only confirmed it. The cafe grew quiet around them. Hannah lowered her eyes toward the folder once more. For years she had accepted that certain doors were closed. Responsibilities had taught her not to dwell on what might have been. Yet now one of those doors stood slightly open. And for the first time in a very long time, she found herself wondering what might exist on the other side. Hannah Brooks took the folder home that evening and placed it on her small kitchen table. For several days, she barely touched it. Not because she was uninterested. Because she was afraid to hope too quickly. Experience had taught her that hope could become disappointment when expectations grew larger than reality. Yet every night after work, she found herself opening the folder again. She read program descriptions, reviewed admission requirements, examined course outlines. The subjects felt familiar, almost like old friends she had not seen in years. Human behavior, communication, decision analysis, organizational psychology, areas she had continued studying quietly on her own whenever time allowed. One evening, she sat by the window while rain tapped softly against the glass. The city lights shimmered beyond the darkness. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had accepted. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell never pressured her for an answer. He respected her too much for that. Instead, he waited. 2 weeks later, Hannah requested a meeting. They met once again in the hotel cafe. The same corner table, the same calm atmosphere. Yet something had changed. Hannah carried herself with a new sense of purpose. She placed the folder on the table between them. Several pages contained notes. Others were marked with colored tabs. Ethan noticed immediately. She had done her homework. "You studied everything," he said. Hannah smiled. "I always study. Everything." Ethan laughed softly. "I should have expected that." For nearly an hour, they discussed options, not dreams, plans. Hannah asked practical questions about schedules, responsibilities, long-term outcomes, and educational pathways. Ethan appreciated that. She was not looking for rescue. She was evaluating an opportunity. By the end of the conversation, one thing became clear. Hannah had already made her decision. She simply needed time to say it aloud. Finally, she closed the folder and looked directly at him. "I would like to try." Ethan smiled. "Good." Hannah shook her head with a small laugh. "You sound very confident." "I am." "Why?" Ethan considered the question. "Because most people need someone to believe in them before they believe in themselves. You are different. You have already been preparing for years. You just did not know whether the door would ever open." The words settled quietly between them. Hannah looked away for a moment. Emotion flickered across her face before she regained her usual composure. A few weeks later, the first steps began. Applications were submitted. Interviews were completed. Recommendations arrived from supervisors who had spent years watching her solve problems nobody else noticed. The hotel's general manager wrote one of the strongest endorsements Ethan had ever read. By early winter, acceptance letters began arriving. Hannah opened the first one during a break at work. She stared at the page in silence for several seconds. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile guests saw every day. A genuine smile. The kind that comes from realizing a chapter you thought had ended was only paused. That evening, after finishing her shift, Hannah walked through the hotel lobby, carrying her apron folded neatly beneath one arm. Guests moved around her without recognizing what had happened. To them, she remained the same waitress they had always known. Yet Hannah understood something important. The night she quietly switched a glass had not changed her life because someone wealthy noticed her. It changed her life because it revealed what had been true all along. Her value had never depended on whether the room was paying attention. Spring arrived in Chicago almost 6 months after the night that changed everything. The city seemed brighter somehow. Trees along the sidewalks carried fresh green leaves. Outdoor cafes filled with conversation. People hurried through familiar streets without realizing how many lives had quietly shifted during the passing seasons. Hannah Brooks stood near a large window inside a university conference center, reviewing notes before a presentation. The apron she had worn for years had been replaced by professional attire, but the calm focus remained exactly the same. Around her, students and researchers prepared for discussions on communication, behavioral analysis, and organizational decision-making. Hannah still found the experience slightly unreal. There were moments when she expected someone to tell her she did not belong there. Then she would remember the countless nights spent studying after long shifts, the sacrifices she had made, and the opportunities she had earned. Little by little, doubt had been replaced by confidence. Across town, Ethan Caldwell sat in a boardroom listening to a quarterly report. The company was performing well. Investors were satisfied. Growth remained strong. Yet one moment on his calendar mattered more to him than any business meeting scheduled that week. Later that afternoon, he arrived at the conference center just as Hannah's presentation concluded. Applause filled the room. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. The kind given when people recognize insight and effort. Ethan remained near the back, smiling quietly. Hannah answered questions with the same thoughtful precision that had once helped her notice details nobody else saw. Nothing about her success surprised him anymore. It simply confirmed what had always been true. After the event ended, Hannah spotted him near the exit. Her face brightened immediately. "You came." Ethan laughed softly. "I said I would." They walked together through the lobby as attendees discussed ideas from the conference. Several people stopped Hannah to thank her for her presentation. Others exchanged contact information and invited her to future events. Ethan watched the interactions with quiet satisfaction. The room saw her now, not because she had changed into someone new, because circumstances finally allowed others to recognize who she had been all along. As they reached the building entrance, warm sunlight spilled across the sidewalk. The city moved around them with its usual energy. Hannah paused and looked toward the skyline. "Sometimes I still think about that night at the hotel," she admitted. Ethan smiled. "So do I." Hannah laughed softly. "All because of a glass of water." Ethan shook his head. "No, because one person paid attention when everyone else was distracted." For a moment, neither spoke. The memory felt distant now, yet its impact remained. Hannah had saved an evening through observation and courage. Ethan had gained something equally valuable: perspective. He had learned that talent does not always arrive wrapped in status or recognition. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it works quietly in the background. Sometimes it changes your life before you even know its name. As they stood beneath the afternoon sun, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of the city, both understood the real lesson of their story. The world often celebrates the loudest voices in the room, yet many of the people who change lives do so in silence. And sometimes, the most extraordinary person in the room is the one nobody notices until the moment everything depends on them.